if you're gonna explore this kind of darkness, then go
Yeah.
into the heart of it,
Yeah,
then
don't do it halfway. Yeah.
no, don't walk up to it and then look through through your hands or
Right.
look away at the last second.
Yeah.
Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by my fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to welcome you to the final episode of our special series titled Cinema of Nuclear Dread, in which we can finally talk about Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. Before we begin, if you enjoy our show and want to help us keep it going, you can support us in two ways. The first is to listen to Cinema of Meaning on Nebula, which lets you enjoy each episode completely ad-free and a week early. The second way is to join our Discord community on Patreon, where you can discuss movies with us and with fellow listeners. Both Nebula and Patreon will also give you instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes. Last month we did Asteroid City, which should be up soon, but there's tons of others. For more information, check out the description, you'll find everything you need in there. Thank you for listening to Cinema of Meaning, now back to the show. Yeah, Thomas, we both saw Oppenheimer. We're recording this about 24 hours, for me at least, after I saw the movie. For you it's even less, because of time difference. Can you capture briefly the first impression of watching this giant, dense, historical biopic / existential exploration of humans causing their own doom and opening Pandora's box with no way of closing it back?
Yeah, that's a good question. I dropped my car keys in the theater, and I had to go back in to get them. And the guys that were cleaning up, one of them was like, "Hey, how was Oppenheimer?" Because I saw like the first available screening, and I was just like, "That's a really difficult question to answer,"
Yeah.
Because I mean, at that point, and I feel like I still am like, what is this, like, 16 hours later, I still am kind of just like trying to wrap my head around the movie. It's a lot of movie. It's really long, and it's maybe Nolan's like most dense movie. It's just like there's a few moments where we get a break from what feels like just like wall-to-wall dialogue essentially, and just like flipping back and forth between names and places and history, and it's like scientific exposition, political exposition, historical exposition, and then like the personal life of Oppenheimer, character relationships, like all swirled together into this mix. And then like the backdrop of that is like the development of this the atomic bomb. So yeah, there's a lot going on, and I have somewhat mixed feelings about it. Like there's moments where I felt like, oh, maybe this is the best thing. While I was watching it, I was like, this might be the best thing that Nolan's ever made. And then there were moments where I was just like completely captivated by what it was doing. And then there were also moments where I just felt like I was being kind of like hit over the head repeatedly with like this just like droning onslaught. There was a second where I was like, oh, we should have named this series not like the Cinema of Nuclear Dread, but like the Cinema of the Dread of like banal American bureaucratic military politics or something.
Yeah.
Like
that's the real bomb.
Yeah, that's the real like villain in the shadows of this movie is not the nuclear bomb, but just like the men behind the scenes who are like pulling the strings.
Yeah.
And there's something about that was very chilling.
Yeah, I definitely think you're touching on a very relevant thematic aspect of the movie.
Yes,
there.
yeah.
There's a literal line in the movie where I think Robert Downey Jr.'s character talks about that the amateurs, they seek out the power in the light or from the sun or something like that, whereas real power, like the real pros, they know how to hide it in the shadows, and that's kind of his character.
Yeah.
Which I think in hindsight, was a great way to frame this movie, or at least the real conflict that is in this movie, which is not so much the bomb, but rather those in power who wield it, and the kind of almost petty emotions that come into play with that, and just the relation between these very emotional human beings who have to deal with these very more mathematical or more physical aspects of the world in a way that maybe gives them too much power for what they are capable of handling. And that to me is what stood out thematically the most, I think, on first impression. But yeah, as you said, it was very dense, and I was anticipating the whole sort of the colored portion of the movie. There's two storylines, the Fission, I think it was called, and Fusion. The first being Oppenheimer's exploration into his field of study, him going to all these colleges and learning about nuclear stuff, and eventually moving into the Manhattan Project. And then there's that second storyline, which is more from Strauss's character, played by Robert Downey Jr., who is going to this other hearing, the black and white portion of the movie, and who also has this interacts with Oppenheimer in this strange way that doesn't get revealed until pretty close to the end. And I was saying, like, I was prepared for that colored bit of the movie where I thought, like, okay, this is going to be about Oppenheimer studying these physics, developing the nuclear bomb, then maybe struggling with the implications of that as the bomb was actually being used in Japan. But I had no historical context for that other storyline. I had no idea who Strauss was. Maybe my European education just didn't cover enough of American politics or American history. But
this era of American politics isn't like my strong suit, but I also didn't know who he was. So it's not just the fact that you're European. It's like he's delving into more specific political or like historical territory here than I think what even most Americans are probably familiar with.
Yeah, I can imagine it was a huge challenge because you're essentially smashing together these two wholly different political contexts, the first being of the Second World War and the other one being of the Cold War, which I guess is to some extent deliberate, as that was also Oppenheimer's experience as he went from being this hero, quote unquote, of the Second World War into the context of the Cold War, where his former buddies from Russia were suddenly like his enemies, and every communist interaction he had with those around him was suddenly a moment or like a suspect aspect of his character. And I can imagine for him that was also a weird sort of whiplash that he wasn't anticipating, and that was maybe to some extent also what Nolan wanted to convey, this kind of whiplash effect from going from one context and being thrust into another where everything is suddenly turned upside down and turned on its head, and where he's now suddenly facing all these attacks on his character and on his reputation and so on.
And having kind of the backdrop, the context of what you're doing and why sort of change as you're doing it, I think was something that the movie conveyed fairly well. There's so much here, perhaps before we get like too deep into the movie itself, because I think there's a lot to discuss here, maybe outside of just what this is saying about the bomb specifically. But like maybe it would be interesting, or there's two things I want to say here. First is we haven't really gotten into spoiler territory yet, and I think this is one where maybe we'll try to like, I don't really know how much spoilers there actually are in this movie because it's just historical. Almost everything that happens is...
There's no real spoilers to the story itself, but maybe to some extent to the way Nolan captures it. Yeah.
We'll try to notify anyone before we get into that territory, since this is still out in theaters and maybe more people are listening to this who haven't seen it yet. So I'll say that. And then the other thing I would say is there's, this is part 3 of our nuclear dread series, as you mentioned at the beginning. It might be interesting at the beginning to just kind of like contextualize where we both feel this movie is kind of landing in this kind of like discussion, the cinematic, like where do you feel like this movie falls in terms of its treatment of this subject matter and how it's coming at just like the basic fact of, the development and deploying of the first nuclear or, this nuclear weapon.
Yeah. I think in many ways it's an interesting sort of synthesis of the 2 episodes we did before this, because in the first one we talked about movies like Doctor Strangelove, Failsafe, which are more of these political movies. They talked about the political conflicts relating to the nuclear bomb, the philosophy of nuclear deterrence. And then the second episode we talked more about the trauma from nuclear war or the nuclear bomb and the fear of, and the way that gave rise to this now iconic metaphor, the Godzilla. We talked about the original one, the latest Gareth Edwards one, the 2014 one, which wasn't the latest, but the latest reboot, I guess. And the way the metaphor changed over time and is different for the Japanese and for the Americans. And so, I think Oppenheimer kind of had an interesting combination there where it's obviously very political heavy, or very heavy on the politics, but it's also, at least it tries to be this very subjective perspective that tries to grapple with the consequences. So there's also this element of that you're watching the perspective not just from those who are making the decisions, but also from those who are living with the consequences of it, which I guess is not so much from the victim's point of view, but in some ways the scientists there's not entirely unsimilar. They obviously don't have to struggle with the literal trauma that the actual victims at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were struggling with, but it's still, there's a perspective there, I think, that kind of is more focused on the question of conscience and the question of personal psychology, and that in combination with the dynamics of politics, the dynamics of power, I think made for a very interesting exploration that I think by and large is fair to the historical debate around it. Like, I don't think it shied away from either sanitizing Oppenheimer as a character and his achievements, but it was also, I think, not condemning him entirely. I think it still had a rightful sympathy for his the way he was essentially caught in this trap almost that ran out of his control. Like, I think the setup or the premise of we have to do this, otherwise the Nazis will, I think is compelling, at least from a historical point of view and from a psychological point of view. I think it's compelling. I think it's to some extent sympathetic in the way that that's, I think, how human beings just work. Like, that's how fear works as a driving force within us. That's how, decisions are made a lot of the times. And but I also like that it's, while being sympathetic of Oppenheimer's plight to some extent, it also explores quite critically his position to his own achievement, or his attitude towards his own achievement, and the way he at first seemingly seems to distance himself from any application of the bomb. He's just like, I'm just the science guy, I just make it, and then it's up to others to deal with the consequences. And I think the movie does right to explore that paradox where he obviously is taking part in something that he's also trying to somehow keep his hands clean from.
Yes, yeah.
and also in the way he afterwards tries to, it seems, seek out some kind of, it almost feels like the Oppenheimer as depicted here is seeking out some kind of punishment, that he wants to be tarred and feathered, I think is mentioned at some point that by Emily Blunt's character who plays his wife, that he's almost inviting some kind of reckoning for himself in order to find peace for his own conscience. And I think that also invokes a very interesting question of whether or not the individual conscience is capable of reckoning with something that's this big, and
right.
how that plays out psychologically.
Yeah.
I think all that was very well done. From a conceptual point of view, I don't think the movie held back with regards to portraying the paradox of Oppenheimer's character to some extent. There's some parts where I did felt the movie could have pushed a little bit further, or where I felt like the Nolan was kind of stuck between wanting to have this honest depiction of like deep dark humanity while also being or wanting to be the mainstream blockbuster director. Like there were, I felt, some moments that I had seen done better in different movies, and that kind of took the edge off, I think, for me, where there maybe should have been a little bit more edge. We'll talk about that maybe in a moment, but for example, the way Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the aftermath of that were treated, I think that could have been a little bit more of a punch there. It was pretty tame at this point, or in this as it stands now.
Right. And I think I would agree with everything you're saying. Like, I think one thing that I was glad to see was at least kind of textually in how the material is treated. I feel like the subject matter of like the justification or the debate of the justification of the bomb is treated, I felt well. Like I was concerned it would tip too heavy in the direction of like, it being justified, but it explains like what the people at the time were thinking in terms of like, this is why we should or have to do this. And then it also, I felt like, laid out like the questionable nature of those justifications pretty well. And I was worried it would make it feel like, this was inevitable or had to happen or something like that. And it didn't lean too heavily at all into that territory, except to the extent that Nolan is kind of painting it as this sort of like the inevitability of this giant machine that this one man is caught inside of and is unable, like any one character is unable to control. So it just, pushes forward, like knocking down everything in its path. There's an inevitability in that sense, but not an inevitability in the sense of like it was morally sort of, there was no other option. I think it clearly shows like there kind of was at moments and should have or could have been more of a discussion about the choice to use the bomb and should have been more of a reckoning with it afterwards, while it was happening, and kind of how, some of maybe how Oppenheimer himself was treated was like part of this process of like not wanting to grapple with the bomb itself, but just, move on or something like that. So yeah, I was very interested by all of that. But I, like you, there was some tension there that is going to be, I think, hard to describe, but I think we'll get into discussing at some point. There was certainly some tension there for me in regards to what you're saying as well, where it was like, there comes a certain moment where it's like all of the people involved, the politics, et cetera, feels kind of like, in the reality of things, it's a backdrop to the horror and reality of what the bomb is and what it did in Japan. And the movie never really flirts with that idea, but it never fully embraces that. Like it ultimately the movie is Oppenheimer. It's got Oppenheimer's name on it. It's about Oppenheimer, and it's about Oppenheimer more than it is about the atomic bomb, I think. Which is like, not necessarily a bad thing, but it creates this interesting tension in the film itself.
Yeah, there's a bit of a paradox there where I think the movie wants to, because it's intrinsically links the bomb and its consequences to Oppenheimer's more personal psychology and his psyche, but at the same time it doesn't. I feel like it connects the two very obviously and very clearly, but at the same time it also doesn't go quite as deep into either of them to really give an insight into the fullness of either one. Like, for example, the colored part of the movie is supposed to be Oppenheimer's subjective experience, and this is very clearly shown where, especially after the Trinity test has happened, or even at the very beginning, you can see these, when he's studying, there's this sequence where he's learning about physics and he's visualizing all these atoms and particles, and it's depicted with these really nice images that are supposed to be, how all this plays in his head. But I feel like, as much as I love that sequence, I think that was one of the early montages that I really enjoyed. That great score behind it that you also get to hear again at the end. It's a great montage and a great bit of visual storytelling in a movie that is otherwise very heavy on the dialogue. I also felt, when I started thinking about it more, like maybe it was a little bit too much. It was more the impression of subjectivity rather than a true peek into what he or how Oppenheimer thinks. Like, you had these visualizations, but they were always these very like quick shots or quick like cutaway shots, and then the story moved on. Like, there was no at least to me it felt there was no real feeling of contemplation there. Like, I thought about this because Nolan mentioned Tarkovsky as an influence. They apparently watched The Mirror beforehand, even though I guess The Sacrifice is more directly relatable because it's also more about contemplating nuclear annihilation. But he mentions specifically Tarkovsky's use of these very tactile shots and this very heavy use of like textures and these long deliberate movements. But if you look at that in a Tarkovsky movie, you can see that there's these very long shots. He really lets you sit with these images. It's not just, oh, here's a shot with great texture. Like, there's also the time that's given to really let that sink in and to let that do its magic. And I felt like with Nolan or in Oppenheimer, Nolan doesn't really give you a chance to really connect with that. He shows you what it is like, but he doesn't bring you into that world as much as I had hoped. Maybe it gets better on the second viewing when you're not concerned with where the hell's all this dialogue going,
right.
and,
and
when you
catching
can just
all
more
the details. Yeah.
That's, I think, my main gripe with after this first impression of Oppenheimer, that Nolan he's so good at doing these big, bold moments with the grand score and everything coming together. Like, that's where he's just one of the best, one of the greatest. But I don't think he's very good at cultivating silence.
Yes.
He does. That's that moment with the slightly moving into spoiler territory here, I guess, with the way he visualizes the Trinity test, where there is when you have a moment so big that there's almost no other way to do it but silent, in the same way that The Last Jedi did it, for example, with that light speed shot, where the one
Right.
ship goes into light speed and it crashes into all the others. When you have a moment this big, there's almost no way to capture that other than eliminating like all the other variables like sound and just having the visual there. And I felt like that was a very nice snippet of what silence could achieve in a movie, which to me made it almost feel like a shame that he didn't do it on more occasions.
Yeah.
That he only, he seems to blast past everything so fast that there's no real way to linger like on any given moment and really have a moment where you genuinely settle into Oppenheimer's perspective. And that's also to me where after the Trinity test, where it also felt like, at the same time you're put into Oppenheimer's head when he's experiencing these visions and this obvious remorse. He's hallucinating these visions of the nuclear blast and the damage that it done, especially in that auditorium sequence, which I think was really well done.
Yeah, I agree.
But at the same time, it also feels like the movie wants to have some ambivalence about what Oppenheimer was thinking or feeling. Like it wants to respect the unknowability of this real historical person. Like he doesn't want to, he knows he wants to go inside his head, but he knows there's a limit as to how far he can really go before venturing into like speculation. And that's unfortunately also what kind of makes that subjective experience of the inside or like the inner world of Oppenheimer feel a little bit shallow at times, and where I feel like maybe more of an internal monologue could have been interesting in the way like Terrence Malick does that, to really either put us in the head of this character and really put us there, or have this more of a outside perspective that's trying to understand them, but that recognizes that there's no way of really knowing what's going on. And now it feels like the movie was kind of juggling both in a way that was effective sometimes, but also not others. Like as I said, I think that auditorium sequence was very well done. But at the same time, there were also other moments where I felt like the movie was interesting precisely because we didn't know what Oppenheimer was thinking, and then there were moments where it was kind of juggled, where I felt like we should have gotten more deeper insights into Oppenheimer's feelings, and we didn't get them. And
I think what you're saying about like the need for silence and some space applies perfectly to what you're describing there with how his character was handled, where like I think there was moments where honestly it would just be like linger on that reaction like a couple more beats to that line. It's like I just wanted, there's all these beautiful huge close-ups of like Oppenheimer's face or something, and it's a stunning performance from Cillian Murphy, but it just feels like Nolan is only invested in like the facts of the situation for vast portions of this movie, and it's just like we got to move on, we got to get this in, we're already at 3 hours, so we need there's some more details here that we got to get to so we can set it up so that you understand what's going on. And it's like, I understand what's going on factually, Nolan, because you're giving me all the details, but I don't understand what's going on emotionally, because there's no moment where it just like slows down long enough for me to what you're saying, like feel what Oppenheimer's feeling or like sit with what he's experiencing. Mm-hmm. And I totally agree that the blast itself, the blast test, and then that auditorium scene in the wake is like the high point of the movie for me. I think it's like an amazing achievement. And there was a moment there where I was like, oh, okay, I get what he's doing, because those moments in the wake of like this just like breakneck pace where we're just going on, not stopping, and then suddenly you like hit this wall and you're like, ooh, here's the reality of all of this, and you're just like faced with it. It almost gives you this sense of like a character who's just caught up in just like getting through it and trying to do it, and like, you don't have a moment to like think about whether or not what you're doing is the right thing to do. It's just like you're just caught up in it, and then suddenly like the reality of it hits and you're confronted with it, and wow, this is, all of a sudden it becomes very real to you. And I was like, wow, this is cool. And then he goes right back to the train just keeps going after that, and you're right back into it. And I was just like, I just need to like catch my breath for a second and be able to like it just absorb what's happening here. But that didn't seem to be what he was interested in doing. And maybe like you're saying, it will get better with a second watch where you're not having to try to absorb all of this. But I found it really overwhelming in that sense, and had a real strong desire to just be able to like just sit with the material a little bit inside the movie itself, and be able to process like the gravity of kind of some of these things that the characters are trying to grapple with, and the tension in Oppenheimer's own life of those things, not just like the political ramifications or whatever.
Yeah. I feel like that's also an aspect where the movie kind of didn't pay enough attention to, where like I went with my girlfriend who was one of her remarks afterwards was like, what the hell was going on with his relationships, Like, did he care about his wife? Because they were flirtatious at the beginning, but then she apparently was an alcoholic, or she had postpartum depression was the one for after the kind of depression that sometimes can be developed after having a baby. But there was not much of their relationship life after a few beats early on, where it became clear that they weren't taking care of their children well enough, or that he had to pass one of them away for a little bit, and then the movie doesn't make it clear enough, or didn't make it clear enough, like what are we supposed to be focusing on here, like what's the important information, because that alcoholism of his wife, or her internal problems, weren't really addressed or didn't get resolved in any particular way, instead of just being there and then staying there, I guess. That might also be just the issue of having to adapt a real life story where you have all these things that in a normal story would be changed or cut out entirely, because if you're just telling fiction, then you have the freedom to make everything more meaningful to the story, whereas with these real life stories you have to kind of grapple with that some things are there but not everything is connected to everything, and so you have a lot more loose threads going on that might not necessarily fit in, but that you also cannot leave out without significantly rewriting history in a way that you might not want to do. But it's also hard to ask for more in this movie when it was already so much, when it already had so much going on.
But I mean that's the challenge of adaptation, and it's like it's not an easy one. And a lot of times with historical adaptations, it does trend too much, or like they play it on the safe on the other side, where it's like, okay, we're going to modify things or cut things out or combine characters in such a way that makes it more accessible for the screen. And, I don't know the source material that well. He's pulling from a biography of Oppenheimer. And the impression I get that, is that its treatment of the historical material is very accurate, but it's like we're getting, all 12, 20 scientists, that are working on this project. There's little story beats with like 8 of them or something, it's like there's so much material here that it's like if you're sacrificing the sort of like emotional and physical content of the story on the altar of like getting every detail, it's like that's the other end of the spectrum where it's like you're making a movie and not a like narrated montage of like an audiobook or whatever. I don't know, that does a disservice I think to what this movie is actually doing. But there is just there's like, I did feel like there's too much, and I don't know what you would have left out, but
Yeah.
I also felt like not all of it was it wasn't that not all of it was relevant, but I just had a hard time understanding, like, what is the through line here that I'm really supposed to care about? Is it the bomb? Is it Oppenheimer itself? Is it the like Cold War political paranoia? Is it the way in which men like Strauss and their petty egos can like have like do all this damage? And then there's this like narrative about like how the truth can get twisted by bureaucracy, and Oppenheimer is kind of being used as a scapegoat and all of these things. And then the relationships are in there, and it's like which of these threads is really like the one that
I think that's kind
meaningful here.
That Nolan punctuation problem that I talked about at length in my 3-part series on Nolan for the like Stories of O channel.
Yeah.
It's usually unclear for me on a first viewing of a Nolan movie, like what's the real piece of information that I'm latching onto, like what thread am I holding on to as I'm being pulled through this story, which Nolan doesn't tend to be very good at.
Right.
It's not necessarily a deal breaker, as I also explained, but it is, especially on the first viewing, it's an issue where you're still, instead of just grappling with the movie and your own feelings towards it, you're still grappling with like the basic text of it, like, wait, how did this happen? But then again, that's also something that I think might resolve on a second viewing, which I'm actually looking forward to because of that reason. Like, because I do feel there was he constructed the dialogue or the hearing sequences in a almost musical way that I think gets better once you are more familiar with the movie and you can kind of tune into the rhythm a little bit more. Because there were these moments where it almost felt like this Aaron Sorkin style sequences where the conversations were just stacking on top of each other and then culminating in this intense moment, which is very much akin to his type of writing. But still, it does feel like there was a kind of a struggle of intentionality there, like where in one moment it would be like The Social Network, the other moment it would be want to be like The Tree of Life, or something more introspective. The other moment it felt like a courtroom drama, like Judgment at Nuremberg, for example, which I think is also a very interesting movie to compare to this one, especially in terms of how you deal with that, depicting the horror of the event that the movie is about. In this case, Oppenheimer is eventually about the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear bomb droppings there. Judgment at Nuremberg, I'm not sure if you've seen it. It's about the Nuremberg trials, where a lot of these, which after the Second World War, where a lot of these high-ranking Nazi officers were condemned or judged for the Holocaust, basically.
Right.
Which is also this 3-hour, pretty much all dialogue courtroom drama. And it's also absolutely amazing. I highly recommend anyone to watch that. It still holds up very much, very well today, even though I think it's made in the 60s somewhere. But anyways, there's an interesting specific comparison there that I was interested in, where in Oppenheimer there's this moment where the impact of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are being explained to Oppenheimer, and he sort of looks away, and we therefore also don't get to see anything of that. And I was just wondering, just for you, what did you think of how the movie depicted the actual impact of the nuclear bombs in Japan, and how that was, or how effectively that was communicated to the audience or to Oppenheimer, or to our understanding of Oppenheimer. For some extra context, in the way it's shown in the Judgment at Nuremberg, there's this scene which lasts for about 8 minutes, where there's also this relaying of information about what exactly went down in the concentration camps. And so, as I said, like the difference with Oppenheimer there is that, Oppenheimer was fairly quick, I think, but in Judgment Nuremberg, there's this really extended scene, and you get to see all this. There's this guy who steps up, and he gives like this pretty neutrally delivered monologue in which he just calmly conveys like this happened, and you get to see like the actual footage from the Holocaust camps. Like some of it is just, it's pretty okay for a movie to show, like just the stacks of like empty shoes, clothes, but there's also some genuinely horrifying images there that I hadn't seen anywhere else, and that haven't left like my brain ever since I saw that movie years ago.
Yeah.
And so I guess the real question is then what's the best way to depict this kind of horror? Because I think Oppenheimer went more in that subjective direction where we're not being shown the actual the face of the horror, but we're seeing like the impact it had on Oppenheimer, or we're seeing in his subjective perspective. He's looking away, so we're looking away too. But what do you think? What's the direction to go there? What's more effective? What's more, what's just the best way to go about that? Do you think?
I'm glad you brought that moment up, because that was a moment that really stuck with me, that I think centers on like what I liked about this movie, and I think like where I feel very conflicted about it. And one thing I want to say before I get into this is like, I was being a little critical earlier, and I'm about to be a little critical again potentially, but I do want to say like, I think this is a kind of monumental film in a sense, like, and I'm glad that it's here, and I'm glad that audiences are going, and like I was in a sold out theater for a movie that's like 3 hours of like dense historical exposition, and is kind of like, not an accessible film. And so I'm glad that this is there. And in a lot of ways, I think for me, it's Nolan's most interesting film, because, it maybe wasn't the most enjoyable cinematic experience out of all his films while I was watching it, but I don't think there's any other Nolan movie where like I went to bed thinking about it, when I didn't dream about it, but I woke up in the middle of the night and like Oppenheimer thoughts were like swirling around in my head, and then when I woke up this morning, it was the first thing I thought about. And it's like no other Nolan movie has like gotten into my psyche in the way that this one has. So I just want to acknowledge that and say that I think like it has some flaws and weaknesses in certain areas, but as a whole, it's a really astounding film.
Yeah. I have some thoughts on that too, but I'll circle back to that at the end.
Yeah. And one that I think is doing something really interesting. And then that's where like the internal debate comes in, is like, with what it's doing, how does that make me feel? And the core of that issue for me is what you're describing here, is kind of like the movie's relationship to the horror of these events. And so yeah, what, like, we see this moment, we hear the descriptions, Oppenheimer himself cannot look, and like this movie also cannot look at those events. It cannot bring itself to look at it. I mean, we get this one like horrifying, terrifying moment in that auditorium where we like screams, these like cheers turn into screams, and then we see a few vague images that like and that like that moment really emotionally impacted me. I think it was like a really good way of conveying some of that horror in a really effective way. But then yeah, like it doesn't, as we discussed already, it doesn't linger with that. And I think there was a huge missed opportunity here to really make the audience have to sit with this reality a little bit. Like, I think it moves on too quickly, and you can make this. I think there's a couple arguments here that are interesting, which is, one is like, okay, this is a subjective movie about Oppenheimer that's putting you inside Oppenheimer's subjective perspective.
Yeah.
And so he's not able to look, and so the movie can't look, and that's like a choice with which to handle the material. And so, therefore it's an appropriate choice. I can kind of see that argument, but I think this gets into a territory where there's this way that the film is handling the character of Strauss. There's this one line, I think his lawyer, I don't know what that character was, but there was that one like lawyer character who was helping him, and he goes, he has this big moment. He's like, you just weren't that important. This whole time. And then kind of like the subtext of like some of that third act and like the way some of that information is presented is like, oh, Strauss wasn't that important. Oppenheimer was the real important one. He was the one who was important. He was the man behind it all. And I think that's like technically true in a sense. And that's something that like Nolan in interviews has said, like Oppenheimer is, maybe the most important man in history. It's like, yes, it's technically true in this certain sense, but we're going to use one of our favorite terms. I'm going to use one of our favorite terms that we like to bring up on this podcast. Like Herzog's like ecstatic truth. I'm like, the ecstatic truth of this situation is that in the wake of the aftermath of what the bombs actually are and what the bombs actually did, Oppenheimer himself is even insignificant. Oppenheimer himself is insignificant in the wake of the scale of the destruction that he took part in bringing about. Yeah. And I wish this movie had really made us like confront that a little bit more.
I think the ending did kind of do that, because that's where there's this whole thing where Strauss misinterprets that conversation that, he walks out to the lake where Oppenheimer has this conversation with Einstein, and Einstein walks away, and Strauss thinks that Oppenheimer said something to make Strauss look like a jerk or something,
Yeah.
But then it's revealed at the end, like that's when that lawyer guy, who was played by Alden, what's his name? Ehrenreich, the Han Solo guy, the new one. He says like, oh, maybe they weren't even, or did you consider that maybe they weren't talking about you? Maybe they were talking about something more important, which the line works, but it was kind of like a little bit on Nolan's more silly side. And then the conversation, we get to see the conversation in the climax or the actual finale of the movie, and it's revealed that Oppenheimer and Einstein were indeed not talking about Strauss at all, but they were talking about what Oppenheimer had unleashed on the world, and how he would, Einstein says like, oh, they're gonna pin a medal on you, but you're gonna have to live with the consequences with this for the rest of your life, and it's now out of your hands. And that's when you get like one of the best Nolan endings I think he has ever created, with the score, that vision again of nuclear destruction enveloping the world, and a great like twist on that earlier conflict where they thought they were going to ignite the atmosphere, which in hindsight, or with the benefit of historical conflict, doesn't seem like that interesting of a conflict, because we know that that's not what happened, and so we know that fear was unfounded at the time. But I like the way they included it and then twisted it around in a sort of metaphorical sense, where it didn't literally ignite the atmosphere, but it might as well have, in the way that the arms race developed after the Second World War, and the way that nuclear bombs got bigger and bigger, and the threat of nuclear violence is, while still being contained, it's still very much there, and more capable than ever at destroying us. And so that, I think, was a pretty perfect way to end this movie. It's just
Yeah. No, I also liked that ending, and I think that kind of makes up for some of what I'm describing, or that I struggle with. And that's one of the things where I really want to see what that feels like on a second watch. It's just like, it's like the bits that are pulling off the part that feel the most important to me, I think like comprise like maybe literally like 20 minutes or like, total running time of a movie that's like 3 hours long. And I think that's where it starts to feel like, oh yeah, you have these points that are anchoring it in kind of like the actual significance of the situation. But then like the rest of it is sort of like buckling in between there, where it makes me feel like I'm not sure. It's almost like the real significance becomes this afterthought to the character of Oppenheimer, where it's like, yeah, but the reason Oppenheimer is significant is because of these things. And so I kind of feel like, maybe there could have been more of a balance there. I want to go back for a second to the question you were originally asking, which was like the depiction of this. Because I think there's more there to maybe like discuss, which is like, I also get, there's, you could make a counter argument for like, well, you don't want to make a spectacle out of this event. You don't like this real life horror is not just like material for like a cinematic blockbuster spectacle. And so I think there's something to be said for avoiding that. But like, I don't know. I just feel like there was it's like you could have just like dropped in there. You even have this color, like, subjective, black and white, objective, like duality. It's like, what if that scene where we see Oppenheimer like not being able to look had just been followed up with just even like a 30-second lingering shot that's just like a city in ruins with just like, smoke rising from it or something. And it's just like for a moment we were forced to just like have to look at that reality ourselves as the audience. Instead, it's like that reality is just subtext, and it's implied, and then we have to like think about it after, which is fine. Like I still think that's significant and interesting, but I just feel like there was a missed opportunity for that like confrontation in the film in a more.
Yeah, it's an issue that I've always felt a little bit torn about, because especially with regards to the Holocaust, there's been endless debate about how do you tell this story, how do you depict it, do you show it straightforward, do you make people understand it more symbolically or indirectly, and I think this is an event of similar magnitude in terms of destruction and violence. And I think I agree with you. The right counter argument is that you don't want to turn this into a spectacle. You don't want to have the montage of very real footage and then the Corenson soundtrack sweeping beneath it. You don't want to include it in that way, as if it is just any other storytelling element. But at the same time, I also feel that just the bare reality, just the bare naked reality can be powerful unlike anything else. I felt like this movie was also the first movie where I felt that Nolan was kind of running into the limits of his insistence on practical effects.
Right.
He doesn't want to do the bomb with CGI. He doesn't want to do any of the Hiroshima or Nagasaki footage with CGI, which fair enough. But at the same time, I felt like the bomb, it was beautiful, but it could have been like 10% bigger, I think, if you had just given into like a little bit more of let the computers do their work. And I don't think that would have detracted from the beauty of practicality. And I think also that auditorium sequence was really great and obviously done with practical effects. The sort of skin burn and the burnt corpse, that was very effective, but it was also very small and still simulated in a way that that isn't like the real thing. And I just I can imagine how this movie would have been if after the Trinity test, the movie, and you had that moment where Oppenheimer is hearing about the consequences of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the movie would have just jumped into this completely silent, just that Judgment at Nuremberg type presentation where he's forced to sit through this presentation about what happened, about what the consequences, and he would just, even if he looked away initially, he would just look up, and then we would get to see like some of the real footage in a moment that is just as silent as the bomb itself almost. But I watched this documentary today called White Light, Black Rain, the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which showed a lot of the aftermath footage, and there's just no way to simulate that practically or with CGI. That's just something that's uniquely powerful about that footage and about those visions of these ruined cities and maimed like individual human beings. And I understand that you don't want to go there, especially as a mainstream blockbuster filmmaker, because it can be maybe genuinely traumatizing for some people to watch footage like that. But at the same time, I think it could have been powerful, unlike anything else, and could have been what made this movie, for me at least, like right now I consider it like a flawed masterpiece, but it could have been for me an instant classic if it just maybe doubled down a little bit more on, if you're gonna explore this kind of darkness, then go into the heart of it,
don't do it halfway.
No, don't walk up to it and then look through through your hands or look away at the last second. That's probably my only hesitation I have about my judging the movie now. That I can't say it would have been better, but at least I think it would have been uniquely impactful if Nolan just had this moment where he broke all his own rules, just let go of all these things that he usually uses. No more stacking of timelines, no more score beneath everything, and just had this moment where for 5 minutes or even longer we just sit with those consequences. And then one of those close-ups of Cillian Murphy, then that would have definitely landed, I think, in a way that would have been absolutely unforgettable. But unfortunately right now I think there's the appreciation grows over time, but right now I'm still I'm struggling too much with just digesting all the things that were going on, and and the pace that it went on with, that there's no really such an individual moment aside from the ending, I think, that grabbed me with with that kind of intensity in a way that Judgment at Nuremberg did. And in that way that you just instantly have a scene burned into like your very soul, and where it won't go away ever again.
No, I think that's really well said, and I agree. I think it's scary to go to that territory, but if you're going to deal with this kind of material, that in a sense is sort of the reality of the situation. And I don't know, maybe this movie does kind of feel that way to some people watching it. Going back to the guys in the theater afterwards, the one guy cleaning was asking me how it was, and the other guy, I guess, had seen it or something. One of the other guys, he said, he was like, it's a real wake-up call. And maybe our psyches are already so seared because we're over here watching Bellatar and Werner Herzog, and we've seen we've delved into some of these more confrontational parts of cinema, and so this might not be quite at that level for us, but it might, I don't know, it might feel more confrontational to people who haven't who are less used to kind of exploring some of that territory in a film.
Yeah.
So I think that's some of where this like subjectivity comes into how that might come across. But I'll tell you what my fear is like there's this really, or the thing that I still nags me a little bit is like there's a really sickening scene in this movie where they go in and they're kind of trying to decide if they're going to drop the bomb. And they're like discussing, which cities? And he's like, we have a list of 12. And then he's like, oh no, 11. We're taking Osaka off because it's very culturally important. And my wife and I honeymooned there. It's a lovely city. And it's like, it's just like the actual destruction, the actual reality of what they're doing is like this complete afterthought to the people who are doing it. And it's so casually treated as if it's nothing. And I'm like, it almost feels like sometimes this movie is also doing that, where it's just like, it's just this almost afterthought that's like nagging at the back of Oppenheimer's mind. And, maybe that's part of what this movie has to say that's interesting, where it's like for the people who do like bring about such, destruction or monumental shifts in history, or it's like, maybe it has something to say about how it's possible to just do something like this and just be like the actual reality of it be just sort of this like nagging afterthought. I think that has some interesting implications. And maybe that's more the heart of what like Nolan is trying to get to in the examination of like this man as a character, where you can just get caught up in this thing and not really have to think about it except where you're like really confronted with it.
Yeah, there's definitely a great depiction of like the banality of evil in this movie in some parts.
Yes.
And one thing also that stuck out to me from the documentary I watched is that there's these interviews with the actual pilots from the plane that dropped the bomb, and there's this guy who says like, oh yeah, I armed it, so I was technically the last one to touch the bomb before it hit the ground. And these pilots, they specifically mention not having lost like any sleep over it. Like there's one guy who says like, I didn't have any nightmare about it like ever. And that to me was also this very chilling moment where for some reason, stuff like this can happen without people's conscience being triggered in any way. Yeah. And that I think is also very much part of the wider landscape that Oppenheimer, as someone who is plagued by his conscience, clearly finds himself stuck in, and finds himself having to navigate this landscape where he has to conform or he's cast out. And so that's also, I guess, part of the later struggle where he wants to stay on the inside in order to exert some influence, because I think the movie also makes it clear that he thought, or at least maybe that was his naive ambition, that he could create this and then he could contain it. Like he can create the bomb as an example of power, or showing the power that is then enough to keep all other wars like at bay. And that, is clearly, as the movie itself also at some point says, like, how can a man who sees so much can be so blind? Also, I think a fascinating aspect of this movie where it does explore that conflict and that tension between being a conscious person in a world that on a collective scale can sometimes feel very indifferent and ambivalent about any moral consideration, and that it's just like caught up in that machine that has to keep on going, otherwise someone else will surpass your machine with theirs, And I think that's something that I might pay attention to more on a second viewing, because I think that's more in the in-between moments that don't necessarily as directly relate to the first half of the movie or the first thread of the movie where Oppenheimer builds the bomb, which I guess is the part, there's that little prologue at the beginning with about Prometheus, who steals the fire from the gods, which I think is very much related in that first section. And then the other one is the part where he's eternally punished for it, which is, I think, very nicely captured in the fusion section, where he's just as Prometheus in a way. He's just punished for what he had done, and both in the literal sense that he's discredited and has his security clearance revoked, and also in the more spiritual sense that he's just completely plagued and will forever be plagued by being the man who has opened Pandora's box and can now no longer close it, and has to live with those consequences of having essentially set fire to a world, or to the world, which is now out of his control.
Yeah, and it's still relevant to our times, that thematic exploration, because not to get too trendy, I'm not comparing necessarily AI directly to the nuclear bomb, but like if you look at and listen to the people who are working on AI and what they worry about, it's like they're very much in Oppenheimer's position, where like many of the people who are like openly working on AI have this sort of same paradoxical like hubris of like, oh yeah, there's a chance this could destroy all of humanity. Like, we know that, but we're also working on ways to contain it. And it's inevitable anyway. If we don't make it, China will. So we got to do it. And it's like the exact same like rationale and reasoning and like stuff that was behind this is playing out all over again with like a new technology. And it's like maybe that new technology will never pan out in the same way. But there's definitely still a lesson about how we go about doing these things and how we justify these things that it's not like we've learned as humanity. So, I think that's territory that warrants certain exploration.
I think it also, to some extent, I thought of this whole story also as a metaphor, not necessarily a metaphor, but I think it symbolically applies also to climate change in a way, in the sense that in this case, we've literally changed like the composition of the atmosphere to such an extent that there's something like some chain reaction has been set in motion that it's only like, it's questionable now to what extent we can still contain it or put a stop to it, or do anything to alter it and there is a very real sense, a fear that this chain reaction too might like envelop the world or might set the atmosphere on fire, metaphorically speaking, in a way that also might, in the future, looking back on this moment, feel like our like Oppenheimer moment, even though there's not one individual that we can point to in this case. It's which makes it to some extent, or in some ways, more interesting, because it's there is something almost impossible about trying to relate the weight of the nuclear bomb and its implications to the psyche of one individual. I think there's just and that's also, I think, very much the paradox that the movie explores. Like, can you place this great of a burden on one human being and then have that make sense in some way, or is it just too big to fathom? And is there, if the man is remorseful, is there a punishment that's big enough for him to be able to find redemption of some sorts? Or if not, is there a punishment big enough so that he can be rightfully punished? Like, is there such a huge disconnect there between the kind of temporal and spatial dimensions that this force of nature or this force of technology operates on, and that we as limited subjective beings are like just too small of a part in to really connect the two in a meaningful sense. And so in that sense, with climate change, it might be more interesting in that way, because it's more directly obvious that this is not the fault of one person who created the bomb, but more of a collective maneuver. But there too, there's very much still a struggle as to how does the individual person position themselves with regards to responsibility or conscience and individual action and whatnot, and as opposed to like systemic movements and systemic changes,
Right.
which is of course very much a very relevant discussion. But yeah, I guess that's going to be another 3-hour movie.
Yes,
that Nolan might make at some point.
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion. I think there's something about there's something about being able to pin it or hinge it on a singular person that is very attractive to the human psyche in a certain way. It's like we can try to make a judgment about Oppenheimer, the man, and that is a way of like, I don't know, there's a sort of like, there's something where humans want to like imagine ourselves as it's like we love this idea that like one man could do this thing that changes history. And it's like almost the debate about whether or not he was right or wrong in doing that is like secondary to the fact that he did it. Like he accomplished it. It's like he became, that's where I feel this like I am become death, destroyer of worlds. It's like you can see two things in that. You can see one in Oppenheimer saying that as a recognition of the reality of what he did. You can also see this incredible like self-aggrandizement where it's like he himself has transcended to the level of like a god capable of destroying the world itself. And I think like there's something about that and grappling with that in humanity that there's a sort of like dark romance to it that is very much in this story that I think is not in something like climate change. And it's like we're almost less able to grapple with that because, just this reality of like bad or good things might be happening on like a society level scale that any one person might not have that much control over. It's like that hurts our ego a little bit in a way that we don't really want to like confront as much. And I think there's an interesting tension there that's definitely at play in this movie, but I think not necessarily explicitly as much as implicitly.
For me, that's I think the more of the emotion that I left the film with, like in that final swelling of the music and that final conversation with Einstein. Like for me, that's the kind of obsession that I walked away with. That idea that there are these greater forces of nature that we are increasingly aware of, but also that we're simultaneously aware of that we cannot fully capture them or even comprehend them in within the limitations of our own individual being. And then this idea that we might set something in motion that we cannot, that then runs out of our control, but is coming to, come back to bite us in the ass or whatever. That to me is also very, something that's been on my mind a lot. And I think that, which this movie really captured quite well, this idea of doing something from which, or of just passing a point of no return in any sense of that you can sort of fathom that concept, which is something that to me has always been somewhat terrifying, like this idea that you can do something which then cannot be undone. I think also speaking more generally about humans, we always have this sense that whatever you do, there's, if you do something wrong, there's punishment and there's redemption. And, there's always this capability to come back to some point of fixture or some point of familiarity, and the idea that you can sort of disconnect yourself or spiral out of that inner like anchoring point and just cast yourself adrift without hopes of returning. That to me, that I think is very fascinating and very scary in a way. And I think that especially when we see now more and more these kinds of conflicts play out on these societal scales, whether it's us messing with nuclear, with the atomic, like with the literal fabric of reality, and us, in the context of climate change, us messing with like the whole atmosphere of the Earth. There's these kinds of issues seem to become more pressing and therefore more relevant, and that's I think one of the reasons that Oppenheimer just has been on my mind like almost 24 hours now. And
yeah.
which I still think is why I always want to skip ahead in time so I can just return to it.
Right.
Having seen it more often and having contemplated it more often, because it is, after all, like, I realize we've been a little bit critical maybe in this conversation, but, aside from that, the small frustrations of that first viewing, I think it very clearly resonated with me in a way that I don't yet fully understand, and that just needs time to kind of have its chance to be articulated. And for me, a lot of my favorite movies are the ones that I didn't immediately walk out of thinking, oh, this is now my new favorite movie. Like, a lot of my favorite movies are precisely the ones that were complex enough on initial viewing that I needed that time to really let them digest and really let them sit with me before I could like develop my own connection to it and develop that own meaning about it. And that so in that sense, sometimes a frustrated first viewing can be a good sign, that it's just so dense with, not just dense in the sense that we talked about, with just that it just has packed with information, but it can also be just dense with complicated emotions and, triggering all these deep, dark, like, feelings and fears and whatnot that just need time to fully envelop themselves and fully express themselves. And that's, in that sense, it can be a good thing. And I'm just looking forward to how Oppenheimer will flourish into something more or something different over time.
Yeah, we'll see. I also am interested to see how I feel about it will evolve. So like, I've had a lot of experiences where I like eventually come to like something or appreciate something more, and then every now and then, like, Tenet was one of those movies where I was convinced on rewatches I was going to like it more, and then I just kind of actually ended up liking it less. I don't really see how that would end up being the case here, but I also think, in the discussion of movies, as we're kind of wrapping things up here, it's like, I think in the discussion of movies, there's often not a lot of space given for like flaws, for a movie to be flawed and still good, where it's like, especially a movie of this scale, it's like there's so many things it's doing incredibly interesting, and I don't think it has to be perfect in order for it to be, like, for example, one of the best films of the year. I think like there's a lot contained within this movie, and I don't think every moment of it needs to be perfect in order for its significance to still kind of be felt, or, for there to be an appreciation of what it's doing or the craft or those kinds of things. So I want to hold that in the balance too, as well, where it's like, this, when you watch a 3-hour movie that's this big, you're getting like almost 2 movies worth of movie anyway. And it's like, I feel like there's a truly great movie in here, and like another different flawed movie, like both contained within the same running time. That's my impression on first watch, and we'll see. Maybe the flaws will fade a little bit into the background.
Last thing I'll mention is that I do think that Nolan again pushed himself to try out new things, which I always admire about him. Like, he's, he makes movies that I think are always flawed in these little and, oftentimes interesting ways, but he's never like boring in the sense that, it's another Nolan movie. Like, he's never like, it never feels stale in the sense that some other filmmakers feel like once they've developed their own voice, they kind of keep repeating it, and I feel like Nolan does keep pushing those boundaries a little bit, even though his first venturing into romance was a little bit.
The audio was well mixed.
Yeah, we watch with subtitles, so that's never. Although here sometimes the movie would go so quickly, and then in these hearings there would be to keep you kind of on track as to who's being talked about. They would be like, oh, and then there's this guy, and there's this 2-second cutaway shot from that guy, so you know who it is. But then if you're also reading the subtitles, you have to go up and down like so quickly in order to keep up. So I try to just listen to it as much as possible, because I usually can understand it well enough. My English is good enough to watch a movie, but when the subtitles are there, your eyes are kind of naturally drawn to them anyways. So I tried not to look at them too much unless I really felt like I'm not understanding what's being said. But that was a kind of uniquely subtitle problem for this movie.
Yeah, I can see that.
And also uniquely Dutch issue is that Oppenheimer at one point supposedly speaks Dutch in a presentation.
Oh yeah.
Which absolutely he didn't. It was just German. I don't even know how mistakes like that are still made, even though it was supposed to be that it was deliberate, that the American just didn't understood the difference between Dutch and German. But then Oppenheimer also didn't correct him. He didn't say like, oh, that wasn't Dutch, I was speaking German.
Right.
So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how that keeps happening. Even with Hoyte, they have a Dutch cinematographer, so Hoyte van Hoytema is half Dutch. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's everything for now.
So yeah, I guess that's it for Oppenheimer. For now, we might revisit it in the future sometime to see how it's kind of settled into the public and in our personal consciousness. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the show and want to help us keep it going, be sure to follow us on our creator-owned streaming service Nebula. On Nebula, you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes. This month we talked about Wes Anderson's Asteroid City, which was a lot of fun, but before that we've also covered movies like Fight Club, Babylon, Avatar: The Way of Water, Drive, and many, many others. You can sign up directly at our Nebula page, that's nebula.tv/cinema of meaning, or just follow the link in the description. Alternatively, you can support us on Patreon, where you'll find the Cinema of Meaning Discord community, in which you can discuss movies with us and with fellow listeners, and the catalog of bonus episodes is also available there. The link for that is also in the description. Thank you for listening to Cinema of Meaning, and we'll see you again next time.